for more information. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen and Raj to get things started with today's presentation.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that introduction, Madison. Really excited to be here today to try to paint a little bit of a picture for how we're viewing the compliance landscape post-Brexit. Obviously, it's a very diverse question set, so we have tried to focus on a few topics today. And as we go through this, feel free to ask questions, and at the end, we'll try to address all the topics we have not seen. Throughout the presentation, there may be a few slides that we don't fully speak to in detail, but again, that's because we're sharing the presentation in essence of time. Now, I'll hand over to Raj just to give a quick highlight of the UK environmental legislation post-Brexit and kind of what the overall landscape looks like before we start diving into individual topics.
Yeah, you can just see at the start where it talks about the EU Withdrawal Act, that was kind of the UK starting point. And then from there, it was all a case of waiting for the actual final negotiation. And then there's a number of different bills that have been taking place, but the environmental bill captures things at a very high level. And they've changed a lot of the existing, what are known as statutory instruments. But the key thing is, like, there is a withdrawal agreement. This EU trade, UK trade agreement at the bottom is a key one that says this is the type of data that you also need to apply on top. So it's lots of data required in different types of regulations and formats. But we'll go into the most relevant ones in the coming slides. Okay, so
we'll start off with.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Raj. It's fine.
I was just going to hand it off to you. Go on.
Perfect. So essentially, we're going to start off with the REACH regulation, something that a lot of our customers and we're seeing in the market ask questions about. So ultimately, in 2021 of this year, also known as the Brexit date, the UK put in place its own independent chemicals regulatory framework, which included the UK REACH. So it's important to note that UK REACH could really almost be referred to as GB REACH, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail. But as of right now, it's really set up to mirror EU REACH as far as possible. Ultimately, we want to try to minimize the disruption to supply chains through these transition measures, and you need to be able to report into the HSE. They're the competent authority enforcing REACH in the UK. Now, to get into what this means in a little more detail for industry, I'll hand over to Raj, who can speak to kind of the two aspects in some districts, which are the divergences and as well the ability for registrations and supply chain obligations.
Yeah, so as part of the withdrawal agreement, the UK had to set up systems that were aligned at the point of departure. So if you imagine that the UK candidate list is basically generated based on the official ECHA one as of the end of January, but currently it's only aligned to the one that was in July. But everything that was like a cut-off point from which the UK should have established its systems. And so, yes, they've got a basic reporting system known as Comply with REACH, and it kind of works that if you're a UK company placing products into the EU, will need an EU representative, and that will need to comply with the EU REACH regulations, and vice versa. If you were in the EU coming into the UK, you would need an EU legal entity to transmit the required data into the UK variant. But right now, it's like, yep, there's data moved freely before, but the data that you need to report is going to become more and more of a requirement.
Perfect. And just before we move into a little more detail on the registrations, sorry, Raj, I just wanted to put in a quick note that there is a little nuance, as with all regulations with Brexit. There are some challenges where here Northern Ireland must continue to comply with the EU REACH regulation. That was part of the Northern Ireland Agreement, and UK REACH is actually applied now only specifically to Great Britain, so England, Scotland, and Wales, but not in Northern Ireland. So it's just an important distinction, and that also has some ramifications for other regulations that came into effect after January 1, 2021, which is also the EU Waste Framework Directive. So Northern Ireland is not held to that standard today.
Yeah. Yep. So, what does this actually mean in terms of the data that you've got in both systems? Well, ECHA have been quite clear that if you were a UK company and you had registration and authorizations in the ECHA system, you had to get your data extracted from the ECHA system and put into the UK system by a set date, from which point they won't be invalid anymore. And this is kind of like where you would have had to recreate the authorization and do it in a very quick fashion with an EU legal entity. And so that's caused quite a lot of disruption. I think a lot of companies might even be aware that things like this have been publicly pushed out by ECHA for quite a long time. And so, likewise, a UK company from, say, England, Wales, Scotland, can create data on the ECHA system, but they can't transmit anything for any notifications because it will just be blocked for saying you're not part of one of the EU 27 member state companies. But for the UK system, as we mentioned earlier, the system's called Comply with UK Reach. That is the UK Reach IT system, and you just need to set up an account with the what's known as the government gateway account. And this is where you have to be. You can create it from any country in the world, but to actually submit data in a Reach format, you have to be from a legal entity in the UK. But it's very, very currently it's very much a duplicated system from the EU system. So you make your 1 ton notifications and registrations in either system. But you'll see these phrases that are completely may baffle you a bit because the UK one's definitely called the UK candidate list, whereas the ECHA one is really now called substances of a very high concern subject to authorization. So they've stopped phrasing it as a candidate list, but the UK tends to sort of rebrand so it's quite clear. So these lists are kind of aligned as we envisage currently and in the short term. But we don't know what's going to happen in the future when ECHA actually announced with the Commission expansions to what's going to be considered an SV8C. So through the Chemical Sustainability Strategy and the recently announced consultation on REACH, the things that come into scope for what will be considered to go on the SV8C list are going to be much, much broader than people are aware. And so that's where you'll see, I suspect, a divergence between the two lists. But in terms of data, the standard ways of doing it and the ways we can set things up.
Yeah, and just before we move on to a quick note again that we want to highlight is that right now, how we're seeing these challenges met in industry is there's 2 lists that are going to diverge. The UK list is going to mirror the EU list currently. And in future, as long as one of the 2 lists is more restrictive but fully encompasses the other candidate list, you can get away with managing your supply chain data collection programs by collecting the information for the more restrictive lists. So in this instance, the ECHA list may be updated, add 2 substances, but as long as that entire list encompasses the UK list, you should be in a position to declare against both if your customers come asking. So it's important to structure your programs to always follow industry best practice and collect the most restrictive version of these regulations. So then you can then pull the data out and extrapolate that as best as possible. And because divergence is something that we will touch on a little bit later, I just want to highlight that anytime you're dealing with supply chain communication, it's really important to lean back on strong contractual language and supplier education, because as these things change and update, you will get questions facing both, and ensuring that you have yourself fully covered for those adoptions will be key moving forward. Now, just before we jump off of the topic of REACH for today until the Q&A session, I always like to kind of end these topics just highlighting the level of detail at which this information for downstream communication, essentially your Article 33 notifications, need to happen, which is REACH is really managed at the article level. And maybe, Raj, because we will be talking about SCIP, and this is going to be a key point, just if you want to quickly touch on the article definition under the REACH regulation and the level that we do need to see this information managed.
Yeah, a lot of people aren't aware that this update to REACH actually happened, but the legal text of REACH actually looks like it's the same as the published version. So when REACH went in, a lot of companies interpreted article to be the thing that was as requested and as sold. That was kind of the flow. But this European Court of Justice ruling that came into effect in September 2015 changed the definition to say you're not going to report at the populated board or at the whole engine level. You need to get the data at all the lowest level components and identify at that level. And that actually, in a lot of respects, made the identification of an SV8C at 0.1% a lot easier, because in the old days, if you're trying to figure out just how many of these things are on this engine and how many make it go over 0.1%, that was a much more complicated way of trying to identify SV8Cs.
Perfect. So again, we're trying to cover off the broad overarching topics, and one of the things that has really caught the market by surprise to some extent is how detailed of a program they may not be running currently for country of origin data and the importance of collecting and managing this data. So we wanted to take some time today to just walk through our view on country of origin data and its importance to building sustainable programs across the organization. So Raj, I'll hand over to you to kind of run through this.
Yep. So if you imagine the context would say the UK pre-Brexit, that you could use standard tariffs to say if a product could move freely without any tariff charges. For example, aerospace products can move freely, and you'd obviously have different tariff codes for different preferential rates. But as Brexit was coming along and as part of the trade agreement, there was clear concerns on both sides that the UK could actually manipulate by signing trade agreements with third-party countries. They could have products that claimed to be UK that weren't actually of complete UK origin to claim these preferential tariff charges. So when you look at the actual trade agreement, and we put a link in there, there's actually quite a lot of detail in certain sections, and specifically there's one section in there that starts talking about this level playing field and this idea of a document that needs to trace country of origin information. If I go to the next slide, I'm sure I put the links in. Yeah, so section 2 of that actual agreement actually calls out under Article 54 this concept of a statement of origin now being required. So you have to think about the way companies currently do sort of pay the tariff charges up front and then try and claim the money back for like standard processes. This thing isn't always instantaneous. It can be 3, 6, 12 biannually that a company will say, okay, we need to go to the customs authority in that region and claim our money back. But it's part of this agreement that works both sides. So this will apply to a UK company exporting into the EU and an EU company placing it into the UK, because this is the actual legal text as ratified by the EU and the UK. You have to get this detailed statement of origin, which is really different to what you might have assumed in the past, because the required level on both sides has to be reported in order to get this the preferential rate agreed. And I think if I go to the next slide, it's kind of, you have to have this data available. It has to be provisioned to each member state custom authority in order for you to maintain that preferential tariff rate. And it's very sort of strange when you look into the actual statement. It's like saying you can either do it for one single shipment into a region, or you can do it for one a batch of your products for X amount of period. But you've got this sort of recurring concept in it that it can't cover shipments beyond a year, so you have to renew it, but it can't last for more than 2 years in its validity. And so, yeah, it's all in Section 2. So a lot of companies aren't even thinking at this level, because if you would have done it based on the process you had before, but now there's a clear process that says, go find where it is, document it, and I'll show you the next slide where they actually say, this is the format that has to be presented. And you're now going to say, I make this, it consists of this, but this consists of things that are sourced from these regions, therefore the applicable tariff codes have to be supplied. And that's going to come as a shock when companies try and go back for your standard processes to claim that money back. And you're going to suddenly find you've got this process, and what you've got today is probably not going to be at the sufficient level that they require in order for you to get your money back and keep claiming it for an X amount of period. Okay.
Yeah, no. Yes. Go ahead, Rush.
I was going to let you do this one. Let's go for the
Perfect.
key concepts.
Yeah, ultimately speaking, when we talk about this, we're talking about a lot of free trade agreements and tariff codes. So understanding the rules of origin data is going to be extremely key moving forward. And when we're talking about your current systems today, on the next slide, we have some questions to kind of take back internally to see where your programs stack up and where there may be gaps. But unless you really understand where your products are coming from, you're not really going to understand the impacts to the business. And this could apply outside of the trade compliance space. And we'll get into that when we talk about the SCIP database to some capacity. Is you also want to understand where your products are being sourced from, your components are coming from, so that when we are applying other regulatory frameworks, you'll be able to identify and properly manage the data for different regulations like REACH, like ROS, the UKCA, and make sure that you understand what your suppliers are most likely going to be preparing their information at, so you can build programs accordingly. Now, there are some question sets that you can take back internally we wanted to put here, as we understand that this is a new topic and you really want to make sure that these programs that may have been existing in the past are set up to handle these changing requirements moving forward. So some simple questions to ask are you systematically reaching out to your supply chain to access this data? Is the system currently mapping origin and destination data to scope out the evaluation activities for not only free trade agreements, but to understand the compliance regulatory obligations for where those products are ending up? Are you soliciting this data from your suppliers for an updated certificate on an annual basis to make sure that all the information is up to date? And are you currently managing and mapping out country of origin data at the component or product level, as suppliers to yourselves may be sourcing from multiple sites, multiple plants within their own business? So a product that you may be purchasing in the past that was coming from the EU could be partially sourced from the UK, could be partially sourced from Europe, and it's going to be extremely important to really get to the minutia at the component level, so when you assemble your products, you can then map that and apply the appropriate treatments for every regulation, not just the free trade eligibilities. Is there anything you wanted to add to this section before we slide over, Raj?
No, I just completely agree with it, because this level of complexity is now going to be required more and more as they bring in new things as part of sustainability regulations they're bringing in and initiatives. It really goes to that granularity, because they want to see things, they're trying to see improvements, and therefore they want to make sure where are these things coming from and are they being taxed accordingly.
Perfect. Now, as we shift out of the kind of trade compliance space and move over to another product compliance regulation, but ties into your market access, which is the EU Waste Framework Directive, Obviously, this is a very big topic, and we have hosted multiple webinars on these sessions. So it's not going to be a holistic deep dive today, but what we are going to focus on is try to tie it in to what's important from a Brexit standpoint. So what I wanted to leave you with here to start off is an overarching view of what a business would need to do in order to run a successful EU waste framework program, which would be identify the products that they're selling into Europe, perform some duty holder evaluations to understand how those products are coming into your facilities, and then ultimately how they're entering the European market. It's important to note the UK does not have an EU Waste Framework Directive skip database requirement of their own. So they do not have a mirror legislation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Raj, but from what we've heard so far, there is no public plans for there to be a skip database created in the UK. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Perfect. So as we go through this, obviously, there's a number of different steps that you'll need to do in order to run a successful program. And again, we've spent a number of times speaking about this from a webinar perspective, and we'll be happy to answer questions in the Q&A session. What we are going to focus on today is making sure that you're structuring your programs to really understand how your products are falling in scope, understanding that only products that enter the EU are going to be applicable for the EU Waste Framework Directive and need to be registered in the SKIP database. Before we jump into duty holder evaluations, I do always want to mention that it's not only products that you will be placing onto the European market, but if you are selling your products to a customer of yours who then sell that into Europe, although you will not be directly responsible in each case for registering those products, your customers may ask you for that data. So understanding that your products may enter Europe or your customers' products will enter Europe is going to be key to really understanding your duty holder evaluations for each product group that you have so that you can structure your program accordingly. And I do want to spend a little bit of time on this topic, so I'm going to hand over to Raj for the next slide just to kind of walk through exactly what a duty holder responsibility is and how you can identify what that means to your business before we go to best practices.
Yep, so this is actually, these duty holder obligations have actually been around since REACH was designed, and it's every big review of REACH has always said this. There's always been a lack of data flow in certain areas. So under SKIP, again, following the 2018 REACH review, it was determined that you've got to do notifications based on the role you play in the supply chain to make sure there's a consistent flow of information. So the obvious ones, the questions are there, but if you import products into the EU that contain SVHCs, then you'll have to perform an importer notification. If you assemble or manufacture products, you'll do the initial manufacture notification that will include a reference to the importer's notification number. And then if you make a complex product based on someone else's product that contains someone else's submissions, it kind of grows and grows and grows at the depth. But this actually follows that European Court of Justice ruling where it's the whole concept of once an article, always an article. And it's quite timely that ECHA are actually going to have we've got a meeting in the IT user group tomorrow where they're actually going to look at the whole thing again to say how complex does it really need to be. But yeah, currently you can't report a single article, which is a thing. You can't have more than 1,000 rows in it. But yeah, so this is the way the data has to flow. If you do touch or anything to transform something, is an article where it contains an SVHC, data has to flow down, and they're expecting sort of importer, producers, the assemblers. Then you're gonna have manufacturers where lots of I buy this based on this, up to the point of distribution, but not where it's a retailer. They've kind of excluded certain areas, so retailers are exempt, but distributors aren't. If they're distributing a product to a retailer, they still have to provide the data. The retailer is sort of exempt from skip submissions. This is very,
Now,
when it came about, it was very more complex than people were used to.
Yeah,
Good.
and one other note I just want to ask Raj while we're speaking about this is something that we've seen with a lot of our multinational organizations who had manufacturing sites and different assemblies flowing freely from the UK back into Europe and then onto the market ultimately. And I just want to make sure that we touch on briefly understanding that if a product leaves the UK and enters Europe during the assembly and then returns back or vice versa, that is also something that companies need to look for. So not only their external supply chains, but how the life cycle of a product's manufacturing could be if manufacturing and assembly happens across the two countries currently today.
Yeah, it's a bit strange, but yeah, you're gonna have to do the country of origin information. You're gonna have to report any hazardous substances. So this is where it's quite strange in the previous context where things could move freely in an aerospace perspective. They still can today, but this level of granularity will need to be reported that it goes out as part X and it might come back as part Y after a plating process, but information needs to be reported.
Perfect. Now, ultimately, when it comes to understanding your duty holder obligations, this is a joint activity where you'll need to understand how those products enter Europe. But once you do, this is the standard workflow, right? You have the ability to submit that data using a system to system connection, which is something that we have developed or you could develop yourself. You have the option to manually prepare those submissions and upload them. And we won't spend too much time on how you can submit the data, but it is important to note here, again, tying back into that reach thought, is you will not be able to register skip data without having an EU legal entity. So Raj, maybe you just want to highlight that again to really drive home the point that you cannot make those registrations from outside the company. And if you can, maybe the foreign user concept and some other ways they can go about that.
Yeah, both systems are playing sort of hardball where you can have accounts as UK companies in either systems, but you can create data, but no data can be submitted unless you're part of the EU 27 in that context. And then likewise with the UK, you can have this distinction between Northern Ireland, which will comply to the EU standards and markings and regulations, but the rest of them, the other three, will be complying to the UK variants. And so in the ecosystem, you can create data, but it can only be transmitted by an EU legal entity, which can either be one of your business units or a third party representing your company to do your transmissions.
Perfect. And that ties perfectly into our kind of last slide on Skip today, which is how you can really streamline the ability to upload and manage your Skip data requirements using what we're kind of coining a hub and spoke model. Essentially, this is going to allow organizations that have multiple sites to try to manage their obligations in a more streamlined way. And Raj, maybe you just want to spend a little bit of time walking through the kind of idea behind this. So a takeaway that we've taken for our customers and how we may be able to structure this for other organizations moving forward.
Yeah, it's literally just looking at working with you guys to look through the flow of products across your organization through its divisions, and then you pick one entity that will act as a sort of the master importer of record. So that'll be the master that makes all the initial submissions, and then by looking at the flow of products across all the different business units in different regions, you can then choose to make simplified notifications based on them being sister companies to the parent company that's making the central submissions. That's one way. Or you could have do it in a much more detailed way of doing it is by each legal entity doing its own submission separately. But this is just looking with you guys to see how your business units are structured and if it's possible to make this type of approach.
Perfect. And some of the advantages of this are that you may have an EU entity that ends up being the hub for all of the initial registrations that may not actually be the site where your main compliance team or resources are located, but it may make the most sense from a financial reporting standpoint to have it there. And then you could designate an organization like Ascent or another member of your business as a foreign user to manage those things. So for UK companies in particular, this is an extremely powerful tool because a lot of the times your teams will be located in the UK, but won't be able to actually register or submit the data through their entity. So what we're suggesting is you figure out how to best map those organizations across Europe, how those products enter the market, so that you can still control the data, you can still manage it with from your centralized organization, but ultimately the registrations are still going to be able to be managed and then disseminated across all the appropriate re-registrations as required. Again, this just minimizes the burden, and this is something that Ascent can really help assist with and use our system to make those re-registrations in an automated way. So understanding how your products not only are built and get into Europe, so how you get that initial data, but understanding how the products are then sold and placed on the market is going to be key to making sure that you have a holistic skip solution. And obviously, Brexit made that a lot more challenging for organizations whose teams were based in the UK or based elsewhere in the world who used the UK as their first port of access into the EU, because that's no longer possible. So you need to consider that. And you can keep existing resources in place, but we would need to take some strategic decisions about how to best utilize those resources moving forward. Now, as we move in here, this is also going to tie into kind of our Q&A session before we hand over to Madison, but it's important to note that Brexit is going to have a really wide-reaching impact on the entire market, on every organization, and on basically every regulation in the space. So we weren't able to cover everything today, so that's why we do want to leave a decent amount of time for Q&A so we can kind of go back through things we haven't covered. But one of the major concerns that we're trying to advise our customer base and prepare for is going to be the divergence. It's now important to note that these are two separate markets, and I'm going to have Raj speak to what that means and how you really need to understand that the UK is no longer bound by what the EU is doing and vice versa.
Yep. So if you look on the chart or slide here, so at the moment the UK isn't obliged to sort of implementing a skip database or its equivalent as dictated by the Waste Framework Directive. I think it's bound to meet the recycling objectives because it was a pre-Brexit thing, but they're not bound to establish a skip-like database yet. And likewise, they already had processes in place that mirrored a lot of the things that are going on in the EU market surveillance regulation, and the UK is taking a look at what's happening in the EU and trying to closely align in that space. But it remains to be seen what the UK is going to do in terms of the equivalency of the EU Green Deal and bringing in a similar sort of proposed restrictions in REACH, I suppose, additional scopes coming into play in sort of in the REACH and the ROS type regulations. So the UK is kind of aligned to the whole situation before the start of the year, but not after. And it's kind of similar but not closely aligned on both sides at the moment. Yeah. But yeah, I'll go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the first one is probably where I'd say go look at what's been proposed in the EU it's the EU Chemical Sustainability Strategy, or it's got a non-toxic title, and that was published in October 2020. And then also go have a look at the recent announcement in the REACH consultation, because in both of those, in both the strategy and the update to REACH, they're extending the scope of what an SVHC can be considered as. Therefore, more chemicals will come into play for reporting into REACH. Just like nanomaterials are today, they get added to sublists, and in a very short amount of time, you suddenly see all these different types of chemicals appearing, which today you'll think, no way, we wouldn't do this under REACH. You now suddenly see that they'll be appearing. And that's where the divergence will really happen. And the things I'm seeing in REACH are a much broader list and type of chemicals and justification needed specifically for consumer products. That's what you're seeing in REACH. And Ross, of course, very much aligned today, but we won't know until next year when the two groups that go on to Ross in the EU get mirrored across into the UK variant. So this is where it's closely aligned today, but as today the UK system's all about making the 1 ton type notifications. If you're bringing 1 ton of a specific chemical above and below, so 1 ton of a chemical, whether it's on its own in a mixture or material or article into the UK, that's the current sort of trigger and reporting into the UK system, where you do the equivalent Article 7.2 notifications. The Article 33 stuff, I guess that's going to really come more into effect in the middle of the year as they publish the update to the UK candidate list. To the UK ROS is like the equivalent. It's the UK versions of existing systems that are already in place.
Now, just to kind of wrap this up, to kind of summarize what we're talking about when it comes to divergences, we can right now comfortably or semi-comfortably manage by following the most restrictive list. So currently today, the lists are closely aligned. Everything is mirrored closely enough that as long as you follow the EU guidance, you're going to be compliant, generally speaking, from a communication obligation standpoint, not necessarily a registration standpoint for these regulations. But what we really want to highlight here is that divergence, especially from the UK legislation, is going to make this extraordinarily challenging. So an example of that could be the UK adds a substance to their REACH candidate list that is not mirrored in the EU, which would mean you'd have to augment your program because you could no longer follow one or the other, because they would be asking for completely different substances at a specific point. And the same with ROS could be the expiration of exemptions. So currently the exemptions are the same. However, there is legislation currently in place being discussed for potential different exemptions to be applied as early as 2022, which could really challenge the way that the UK and the EU needs to be enforced moving forward. So as of today, it's important to note that you need to start building strong programs to manage these existing systems, but keep an eye on the future and always keep an eye for divergence, because that is where you're going to get caught out. Industry is really going to be caught off guard, and your supply chains who are outside of the UK or EU are going to need a lot of hand-holding and education, because it may be a substance that not all of their customers are asking them for moving forward. So divergence is really where you want to future-proof your programs to make sure that you can be flexible, scalable, and adaptable to these changes coming up.
Yeah, I think that's actually happening at the moment. I'm pretty sure the UK is taking a restriction for a substance straight to the POP's global restriction. So they want to restrict it in the UK, bring about a global ban, and the EU will probably catch up 12 months after the UK actually implements that one. That one's about 2 or 3 years away, but it is happening.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So we'll hand back over to Madison to kind of wrap up the prepared slides today, and then we'll dive into the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you both for that overview. As always, like to highlight some of our upcoming webinars. One next week, looking at the TSCA timeline, so that regulation that's based out of the US, and staying ahead of your requirements. And then at the end of the month, we're looking at the journey towards a new corporate duty to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. So kind of looking at how human rights regulations and stuff are moving to a more mandatory landscape, especially actually within the EU. So that should be a great program toward the end of the month. As mentioned at the top of the hour, we have our Supply Chain Insight event coming up on June 16th and 17th. It is a complimentary event, lots of good sessions on different topics, and it's split between 2 days and kind of over a variety of kind of different time zones to tailor for both North American and European audiences. So feel free to check that out. And last but not least, although we're not even quite halfway through 2021, planning for a compliance budget, for next year, can start now. So if you were interested in some of the content we covered today and how Ascent can help you, feel free to click the Get a Quote button and someone will contact you directly. And last but not least, just a quick reminder to everyone that this presentation was recorded. Following today's webinar, the same link that you actually used to join the webinar today will actually allow you access to the on-demand version as well. So you'll be able to go in there, throw your email in, and you'll have access to this recording as well as the slides, which can be found in that handout section along the bottom. And in that handout section, there's also some other relevant topics like a blog post, and as well as a link to that state of compliance survey I spoke about if you want to get your voice into the benchmarking of compliance programs. All right, so there are a few questions. A few may have been answered during today's program, but we'll circle back to make sure that everyone is clear on them. The first question here I'll ask is, if a supplier is in Europe but sources base products from China and uses the parts to supply into the UK, is the product supplied classed as a country of origin equaling European? And maybe Raj, I can get you to answer that one.
The answer is no, because it will depend on having that level of granularity of data, and if there's specific rules for a specific industry sector. By again, what I mean is that there's different EU initiatives where things like sustainable batteries is one of them, where they've set specific quotas for things being made in the EU and recycled. There's a concept of putting recycled in the EU on product labels, and so it will ask for things to be identified as specifically done and made and produced in the EU. And likewise, the equivalent UK systems will exist, and both of the agreements will have the different industry verticals what they class as being considered as true EU content. It's kind of like there was a scare factor that the UK could sign multiple free trade agreements with different non-EU countries, class the products as UK, and place them onto the EU market as UK to get UK preferential treatments. And it's like a vice versa on both sides, what has to be clear and clearly identified. That's why it's different to what companies think they're doing today.
And this really just goes back to stressing the importance of having a strong program to have communication in place with those supply chains, because as Raj mentioned, it's a very complicated topic, and each thing will be almost on a case-by-case basis. So there will be applicable cases we can help guide on, but also the more data you have, the better the communication channels are with your suppliers, the better your understanding. And if things flow directly from China to you, that could mean something completely different than flowing from China being assembled into you. So it's important to get that data.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you both. Does skip apply to existing products placed on the market that were before January of this year?
Yeah, technically there's always this thing in a lot of EU regulations where there's the effective date or the date of application, and things before are always not considered in scope. So technically, if you had a product on the market that is sold as is before, then you might not have to give the information. But bear in mind, if you make a change to that part or a modification, that would be classed as a different article in effect because you've made a change, and that would need reporting. And so it's a very strange game. I'd avoid it and just get the data, because someone's always going to ask you for it.
No, I think that's very good advice. I think you kind of covered this a little bit, obviously, in the presentation, but just confirming that there likely will not be a UK skip, that there's not two separate databases that way.
Yeah, it's actually quite funny because I know we said it in the presentation, but I've just, as part of my research, I work with the UK Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. So there's a research paper that's coming out with academics. One of the key outputs was to recommend putting in front of a select committee that says we need a central database for chemicals, and we need a REACH skip-like database. So it will be suggested, no doubt never implemented, but it is something a lot of academics have put forward as being needed. Of course, it's just duplication. There's no way of avoiding not having the data if you just manufacture in the UK. If your products can appear in the EU, you just have to have the data or collect it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Could you clarify, is UK REACH only required for chemicals greater than 1 ton? And does it, and is there an electrical articles exemption?
So the 1 ton is only right now for the notifications like a REACH Article 7.2 notification. So that system set up. The UK has published its candidate list, and the reporting obligations are exactly the same, but to the UK statutory instrument that's applicable to REACH and the one that's applicable to ROS. You do actually still have to report in exactly the same way you would to the ecosystems, but to the UK variant if that product goes into England, Scotland, Wales, but not Northern Ireland.
Okay. And sorry, did you say that, is there an electrical articles exemption?
There is a ROS.
Oh, looks like
I think we lost his connection for a second.
There.
All right. Well, I will wait for a second while we let's see here. There was another question just regarding someone was interested in the CE versus the UK CA requirement differences and the skip differences. I think a lot of that was covered, so I do hope, Pam, that we were able to answer your question. Yeah, I don't know, Stephen, if you want to maybe just
a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can touch a little bit on the UK CA while we wait for Raj to join. So, as most of you are aware, the CE marking was a self-declaration of conformity that was available for Europe. The UK has created their own marking, the UK CA mark, which is going to replicate goods being placed on the GB market. Again, a little bit of confusion there. So, Northern Ireland is not applicable. They can still utilize the CE marking. This UK CA mark is going to be mandatory as of January 2022. So for most goods, there are some exemptions. There are some products that do have different rules. So I would ask you to look through, and I can provide some links to that. But essentially, it's at the gov.uk guidance for placing manufactured goods on the market in Great Britain. There's some information there. But ultimately, it's a new requirement that you will have to have a UK declaration of conformity citing the UK specific regulations and the BSI standards. So you'll need, essentially, for products going into the UK, UKCA, and for products going into Europe, the CE marking. As of right now, I'm not fully aware if either would be accessible for the other markets. I'd wait till Raj comes back for that. But our understanding is that you'll probably need both.
You need both. Sorry. They're completely separate. So all the EU regulations will not accept anything that's UK certified, and the UK's vice versa.
Okay. So just a few more labels on packages then.
It'd be confusing on the number of labels.
Yeah. I think where you cut off, Raj, was just we were getting clarification if there was any exemption on electrical articles for UK REACH.
Really?
Only if anything was exempt for reporting in, say, ROS. So, and that would be sort of the large stationary machinery type exemptions. So they should have carried all the exemptions and reporting requirements from WE and ROS should be aligned.
Okay.
Just the UK variant.
Right. A question also came in here. Are there any WE recycling requirements for UK or WEEE recycling requirements?
Yeah, the UK ones will still be applicable and aligned to the same targets that were originally agreed to as part of the EU agreements.
So if we go back 2 slides here, I'm just going to quickly jump back. It's important for a lot of these questions that I think are going to fly in, um, is that any directives or regulations that were negotiated prior to January 1st of this year are most likely still in place in a similar format today. So again, watch out for divergence, but just because Brexit happened doesn't mean you don't have to apply to laws that existed a year ago or 2 years ago. For the most part, the idea here was to minimize the divergence as much as possible. So anything that was in effect prior to January 1st of this year is most likely still in effect. However, new things like the skip database that went to effect on the 5th, and new regulations that'll come out, that's where you'll see really big divergence, and it may not apply in the UK or the EU, conversely, depending on who creates the regulation. Anything that happened prior to the start of this year is most likely still in place, just with potentially tweaks to how you have to report.
Yeah, and as you'll see, they seem to be giving it a 1 year grace as well. So, like the CE marking and the CA marking, there's like a 1 year grace window where that's probably where they're expecting all the big changes to occur after the first year.
Yeah, good clarification. I appreciate that. There's a question here. Is the UK or Great Britain have their own version of ROS with exemptions? So I guess that kind of goes back to your question, or kind of your point, Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, you should be able to find that through the DEFRA links. It's weird because it's
Currently
like DEFRA.
today.
Yeah, go on.
Oh, go ahead, Raj. No, go ahead.
I gotta say, the UK is quite strange in that one department manages another department, but all the data has been published on the UK Brexit site for the HSE.
Got it. Let's see here. If I am a US company and I have an EU supplier, do I need to submit to the skip database?
It depends on the flow of product. So if you're a US company, you're buying something from an EU company, are you turning it into something else and then selling it into the EU?
I would assume in the treatment here, it would be they manufacture it in the US and then sell into the EU. So they probably sell to a distribution channel would be my overall guess, if we want to speak to that example, which I know we've spoken to a few times in the past as we come up on the time here.
Yeah, so that's the typical case where you'd have to provision that customer of yours with the data, because the impetus to report is always, the onus, I suppose, to report is always on the person or legal entity that completes the import documentation. So if you're completing the import documentation and receiving the article in the EU, you have that legal obligation to report. It kind of doesn't matter if you're completing it or not. You'd have to get it to give it to one of your customers to actually enable you to keep selling that product into the EU.
We'd be happy to have a session offline if you have those questions to send them follow-ups to us, because that's a very common use case that we're tackling for a lot of our customers, and making sure that we structure it so you control your market access and not your distributors, which is your ultimate goal.
Yeah, absolutely. What about this? So how do spare parts apply to UKCA? I think so.
I think they do in terms of the context of when they're new.
Okay.
It's the point in applicability and if they're held in stores anywhere, because some chemical regulations and product regulations are strange. They always apply to new things, but things that are already in the market, they always seem to be out of scope. But REACH is changing. EU REACH is changing. Today wouldn't even look at spare parts. In the future it will.
Okay. Do all UK companies selling into the EU need to have a declared EU authorized representative based within the European Union?
Yeah, because if you look at the market surveillance regulation, there is actually a very specific role called out saying you've got to have a legal entity or an authorized representative for the regulatory aspects. And that sort of come about from it's come about from the medical device regulation was the first one that says you've got to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance. And the market surveillance regulation's gone further and said, yep, you've got to have someone that covers all your product compliance. And then you have these other directives that are coming out that say your directives have to be defined to meet the ESG, the environmental sustainable corporate governance type objectives, because they're looking to identify people that can be held responsible, and in different regulations the penalties can be imposed on the director responsible, and who can legally then have the regulatory person responsible challenge. And they've actually set out criteria for what even the skills that these people should have.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Perfect.
very different.
Yeah. So we have reached the top of the hour. Now, we actually are going to try something new. Stephen has allotted 30 minutes of extra time. So if there are some questions that people want to have kind of a discussion or a bit more of a, face-to-face, I am going to post a link to the chat. Let's see here. 1 second. And if people would like to join this... All right, everyone should have access now to a Zoom link. It would pop up in your question and answers. If anyone would like to join and have a discussion with Stephen following today's webinar, feel free to click on that and you can join him. For anyone else, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Raj and Stephen, thank you for sharing your expertise. This was very interesting. As mentioned before, it's recorded. You'll be able to access it following today's webinar, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks again, and have a great day, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.